Coming up, it's Coachapalooza. The Cavs hire Kenny Atkinson. Does that mean James Borrego is going to the Pistons? JJ Redick gets introduced. Paul George and Klay Thompson might be staying home. We'll talk about that. Plus, Scotty Barnes got a huge new deal. And what is this draft? All that and more on Locked On NBA.
You are Locked On NBA, your daily NBA podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On NBA, your daily source for all things NBA from the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for joining us and making us part of your life. Checking us out daily. We do appreciate you being in every day or listening to us across all of our great shows here on Locked On NBA. Glad to have you with us here on a Tuesday. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As the playoffs wind down, the sports stop sportsing like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. My name is Matt Moore. I'm the senior NBA writer for the Action Network, and I'm co-host of Locked On Nuggets. I'm joined by David Ramil. He's co-host of Locked On Heat. On today's show, we're going to talk about this wacky, very strange NBA draft where everyone is kind of like, I guess we'll pick someone. That's the general sentiment. And if not, it's, hey, does anybody want our pick? We'll talk about that. Scotty Barnes got a boatload of money from the Toronto Raptors. Paul George and Klay Thompson may not be changing teams after all. But we start today, David, with Coachapalooza because it is a big coaching day in the NBA. We'll start with right here as the Cleveland Cavaliers hired Kenny Atkinson, according to Adrian Wojnarowski of ESPN. Atkinson, of course, a former assistant with both the Golden State Warriors, and he was a presumptive coach for the Charlotte Hornets, and that didn't work out. But he was a former head coach with the Brooklyn Nets. I have my thoughts on this one, but I want to get your kind of reaction. What do you think about the hire of Kenny Atkinson by the Cleveland Cavaliers?
I love it. I loved what he did in Brooklyn. I thought it was a great move. I thought he did a really good job there of getting everybody to have some kind of identity. They were in that post terrible trade, kind of middle ground there after the retiring of Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce, and the franchise was just kind of lost and aimless there. And he took a young core of castoffs, including D'Angelo Russell, Jared Allen, who gets coach again, Karis LeVert, and others, and he made them fun. He made them challenging. He made them seem like they had a bright future. And then the Nets front office went and messed everything up. That's a whole other situation there. So I like what he could do. I think now a couple of years of even further seasoning in Golden State, coaching larger egos, teams with expectations. I think he's a really good candidate. He's been a really good candidate for a while, and I think he's got a great opportunity to take Cleveland and maximize what was a really talented roster, and one that unfortunately JB Bickerstaff could not maximize. So I like Atkinson as a fit there. I'm just curious to see how it plays out now with Donovan Mitchell and his future, but that's a whole other different conversation. As far as the hire, even if they don't keep Mitchell around, I think it's a good fit there.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that because my big takeaway is that this is all part of a package deal. My understanding, at least people are in the league, are of the opinion that this was Donovan Mitchell's preferred hire, that there was a number of options on the table, including James Borrego, who we'll get to in a second. But that Atkinson was the preferred coach for Donovan Mitchell, who's looking at a 3+1, 3 years at a max, plus a fourth-year player option with the Cleveland Cavaliers. The next kind of questions are going to be about Darius Garland, but we'll get there. I do agree with you. I think the Atkinson hire is absolutely phenomenal. He did a really great job in Brooklyn. Now, part of the reason he did really well in Brooklyn is because he had a lot of options with how he could coach them from a personnel standpoint. There wasn't a superstar. So if he needed to bench D'Angelo Russell, he could do that. If he needed to go to a different option, he could do that. But obviously Jared Allen and Karis LeVert have experience with them. They're going to be comfortable with them after he was instrumental in kind of raising them up and helping their development. But I also think that in large part, Atkinson's just like a really smart basketball mind, and he's open to versatility. So like, he's a problem solver. That's kind of how I put coaches is, are you a guy that builds a very tight structure that can sustain over time, or are you a guy that can kind of problem solve with what the roster presents? I think Atkinson's a guy that his teams come prepared. So in that sense, he builds a good foundation. But X's and O's wise, he's very flexible, and he's shown that he's willing to, like, they were running stuff, like they would run zone and then they would switch and then they would do 2 on ball and then they would play drop. Like, that versatility defensively is really important, in my opinion, in the NBA. And I think they're going to have that same optionality with this roster, especially with given the fact of, if Evan Mobley over time takes on a larger role and maybe moves into that center spot, you can do a lot more with Mobley. And I think that he's going to really benefit from Atkinson being his coach. Donovan Mitchell, Atkinson, longtime NBA guy, been around the league forever. There's a comfort level there. I think it's a great hire. The question then becomes, okay, so James Borrego doesn't get the Lakers job and he doesn't get the Cavs job. So now the question is he going to wind up in Detroit? And there's a number of options still, I think, on the table for Detroit. And you never really know, after paying a guy $65 million just to go away, what exactly they're going to do there. But it would make a lot of sense to go ahead and hire longtime assistant, former Hornets head coach James Borrego, and go that route if you're the Detroit Pistons. He seems to be the best candidate on the board. I have some qualms about it despite liking Borrego, but I'm curious as to what you think about the idea of Borrego in Detroit.
Yeah, I have similar qualms. I don't know that he's ever had the same kind of, he does not have the same resume as Atkinson, obviously. He just does not have that same kind of success. His tenure in Charlotte wasn't great. Maybe he got buy-in from those players and he just didn't assemble a good roster that he was able to get over that next hump. But, in Orlando, he was the interim coach. And yes, for everybody that wants to look at the Popovich coaching tree and say, well, obviously it's going to have some great, branches that stem out of there. I don't know that Borrego is the right fit for Detroit right now. I'm not sure who it is. I mean, he might be the best quality candidate, but I'm sure there might be somebody else there that could probably bond with that team and get them to that next level, because they have to be, if not necessarily in playoff contention, they have to certainly show significant improvement over what they did last year. And I don't know that Borrego is the guy to do that, but I'm curious, what are your qualms about him? Because I mean, he's respected. He certainly is respected as a great assistant, but I don't know if he's necessarily the guy to be the head coach of your team.
I liked him as a potential candidate for the Cavs job. I liked him as a potential candidate for the Lakers job. I have a little bit more worries about this just because
it's a fully fleshed out product as opposed to like building them from the ground up. Yeah, okay.
Borrego's a great X's and O's coach. If you go back and you look at how those teams profile when he was in Charlotte, he was getting the most out of that talent. Like, there's a reason that they have fallen off a cliff. And I think Steve Clifford's a good guy for trying to establish culture. And even Steve Clifford couldn't do it. That's how bad that locker room was. Now, there's no indication that Detroit's as much of a locker room cesspool as Charlotte was during Borrego's time there. Like, Cade Cunningham seems like a pretty stable, normal dude to kind of build your franchise around.
Yep.
I can say that, and then 5 years later he could be Kyrie. But I think right now it seems like there's a little bit of stability there. But there is, I think, a little bit of just my concern with you're handing another guy that struggled with a young roster, another young roster. And he got the most out of Charlotte, X's and O's wise, but couldn't sustain because of the culture. And that's such a big part of it. Is like, you got to be able to manage the team. And you're the CEO effectively when you're head coach. And so I have some concerns about that. But if the Pistons just have like a normal locker room, if like just things are okay, this could work out really well. Because I do think that Borrego is both creative and sound in terms of how he approaches the basketball side. Like, the game should be better. Not that Monty Williams isn't a great one, but Monty Williams is like the opposite of that. It's like, he is all culture, all foundation, not really going to do a whole lot in terms of creativity, X's and O's wise, even though the Suns had really good offensive and defensive ratings. He can do that with established teams. Borrego is much more creative, but I just have questions about whether they can build the culture.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good question. I'm curious to see how it plays out. I'm hope that he can something there. And, as a person of color now, I think he's also, an opportunity for him to kind of showcase what Latinos can do in the NBA and be a good coach there. So I'm curious to see how it works out with that locker room, because they've got to overcome a lot of losing ways over the last couple of seasons. So I don't know. You've got to find the right balance of not just X's and O's, and maybe that creates enough buy-in so that you can improve the overall locker room culture too, because that's going to be a huge challenge.
2 more quick coaching notes. Chris Finch agrees to a 4-year deal.
Your guy
came on the air. Yep, just before we came on the air. 4-year extension goes through the 2027-28 season. This one was pretty obvious. Like, Chris Finch has gotten him in the playoffs 3 years in a row. Chris Finch has taken them to the Western Conference Finals. the Wolves have won like one playoff series, and now they've actually won 2. So it makes a lot of sense to go ahead and get Chris Finch locked down long-term, regardless of what the future of this team looks like with the roster, with Mike Conley and Rudy Gobert getting older and the questions about Karl Anthony Towns and his long-term fit. I think it's pretty safe to say that Chris Finch should probably be the guy for Anthony Edwards going forward.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good move. It's a smart move. It makes a lot of sense. It's a done deal.
And finally, JJ Redick was introduced as coach of the
Oh,
Los Angeles Lakers. Said that math is going to be a big part of his deal and that there will be no podcasting. He says he hopes to. He's been excommunicated from content he hopes for a very long time. I like JJ very much. I actually think there's some optimism here to be had about his role as coach. I think he's going to be a creative guy. I think he's going to find creative solutions and approach the game smart. However, JJ, you're taking over as coach of the Lakers, so let's not make any long-term plans, buddy. Leave all doors open, because that guys in that position don't last very long.
I'm kind of optimistic about it as well. I think the problem will be when things don't go 100% or when they don't go well, and they're going to have a stretch like that at some point. And how does he respond to the naysayers and the public outcry and even some of the tension in the locker room that you're going to have with a guy like LeBron James and Anthony Davis and all the other vets on that team? Like, can he build on his relationships with these players, his ability to communicate with them, which is such a high level, I think. And we've seen that through the podcast. Maybe you want to dismiss it as just, oh, you know what? It's just him talking in a microphone. But to talk to somebody like that, I think matters. And not just because it's a media opportunity, but also because it shows that he can relate to these players, even though he's been retired for a couple of seasons now. So I think he's going to get mostly buy-in. But when the crap hits the fan, and we know it's going to happen at some point, how does he respond? And does the locker room believe in him enough that they will support him publicly and privately? And I think that's a huge question moving forward. But I don't know. Outwardly, I'm optimistic, but I do have concerns.
Redick did say that he and LeBron did not talk about this decision at all before the hiring was made, and everyone believed them.
Yep, 100%.
Up next, we're going to talk about free agency. Paul George and Klay Thompson may not be changing teams. Plus, Scotty Barnes got the bag. We'll talk about that up next here on Locked On NBA. It's summer, which means you got baseball to bet on, but you've also got WNBA. Man, is it awesome right now. I had the Sky as 1-point favorites versus the Fever. They closed as 1-point favorites in that game. Phenomenal game. Comeback by Angel Reese, who is now live to win Rookie of the Year. What a sensational story that would be, given all the Caitlin Clark hype. Also, look, big Commissioner's Cup game with the Lynx and the Liberty. I like the Lynx in this game. There's a lot of sharp action on the Liberty, but I really like the Lynx. I just think that they're playing better right now, as good as the Liberty are offensively. The Lynx are really well balanced. I think they're live to win the Commissioner's Cup. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day all summer long. So head on over to FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. We'll be right back on Locked On NBA. Second segment here on Locked On NBA. Thanks for joining us and making us part of your day. So kind of the first big conversation here, I think, to be had, David, is about Klay Thompson and Paul George. The news kind of broke over the weekend that the Philadelphia 76ers are at least indicating to league sources, according to various reports, that their interest is waning in Paul George. Now, there's a couple of connected reasons for that we'll get to in a second. But I do think that if we look at, there's kind of this sense around the league that he's probably headed back to the Clippers from people I've talked to. And the reasoning kind of is they didn't want to give him more money than Kawhi, but they might give him more years. And so the total money might wind up being at least within approximate range. And so that can be like the wind up being the conversation, or the opposite, where they might give Paul George more money and Kawhi more years. Actually, I think is the way it was kind of framed. So I think there's a good chance that Paul George is back with the Clippers. Klay Thompson, there's all the talk about wiped the social media of the Warriors, etc. But what I've kind of started to hear is the Orlando Magic are only going to be offering a short a 2-year deal. Like they're looking to do the Fred VanVleet with whoever they bring in for this 2-guard spot. Is they want to pay somebody a whole buttload of money on a 2-year deal and then not have to commit long-term to them. And I think if you're Klay Thompson, you probably want to go ahead and extend your career. So if the Warriors are offering less money, but they are willing to go into more years, that might be a way in which Klay Thompson actually returns to the Warriors. So I'll ask you this, David. What do you think is more likely? Paul George returns to the Clippers or Klay Thompson returns to the Warriors?
Ooh, at this point, I'd say Klay. I just like, I don't know. I'm just thinking of it from a personal perspective. Like you've become such a fixture there. It's at some point you have to choose quality of life over anything else. Like I know there's ego involved, and you don't want to get slighted. You don't want to feel like the team doesn't value you enough to give you that bag. But it's not like he hasn't been paid. And it's easy for me to say, oh, you know what? I wouldn't take whatever $50 million they'd be willing to offer, or I'd pass up $50 million from the Orlando Magic in order to play for Golden State. But you've built something there. You were a part of something historically special. And to me, I feel like that should maybe take priority. Like, I can't speak for him and what his preferences are and what his personal beliefs are. But I just saying, for me, I would think that it would be more of a priority to remain in Golden State, to continue to add to that legacy and everything that they've accomplished there. With Paul George, it's not that he's a mercenary necessarily, but he's played for a lot of teams before. But if they can offer him what he wants in terms of the years, the money, whatever stability he's seeking on a financial, contractual level, that makes a lot of sense too. And I think the kind of pressure is off of him in Los Angeles to some degree. He's from the area. He can appreciate that. At the same time, he can just play high level basketball. And I think the expectations are somewhat lowered because you know what? They're not the Lakers. And so that's kind of the idea moving forward is, we can still win a lot of games and maybe we'll compete for a championship. Maybe we won't, depending on how healthy I am and how healthy Kawhi is. And if that's the case, you know what? You can still thrive and have a good life and still play in Los Angeles, which isn't that bad.
I mentioned kind of the sequence here. So it is notable to me that the Philadelphia 76ers interest in Paul George waned over the weekend. And on Monday, OG Anunoby opted out of his player option and will become an unrestricted free agent. And there is a lot of conversation about the idea that OG is not happy with the Knicks offer for him. If you're the Philadelphia 76ers, and there was some tension with Nick Nurse and OG Anunoby in Toronto, but this suddenly, I think, looks like a pretty attractive option to add if they can't get Jimmy Butler and if they can't get Paul George, or if they don't want to get Paul George. OG Anunoby, even with his injury history, I think adding OG next to Joel Embiid is obviously that's a big yikes in terms of the injury stuff. But basketball fit-wise, that makes a lot of sense to me. So I am kind of curious about the sequence of those events and how they unfolded over the past couple of days.
Yeah, that is interesting. I don't know. Does Anunoby right now just kind of use Philadelphia to gain more leverage against the Knicks? Is that how it would play out? Because, we don't know what's happening from the Philadelphia side of things. Like, their options are dwindling. If they're not interested in George, and it's not like, Jimmy Butler, the trade could happen. And I think, Wes and I on Locked On Heat have both said that we think it's not just possible, but almost likely that Jimmy gets traded. If that doesn't manifest for some reason, is Anunoby a realistic, is that somebody that they would realistically pursue and be willing to pay the kind of money that he's seeking in Philadelphia? I'm not so sure that they would. You said from a fit perspective, yes, but that's a lot of money for a player who still, has a huge history with injury and some concerns moving forward. Do you think that they'd want him as their, third, fourth best option at this point?
I think it's a great fit. I think if you got Embiid and Maxey, you put OG Anunoby in there. That's a really good combo, man. You got a defensive wing that can guard all those guys in the East. You got a guy that can hit the three.
If he's out there.
Yeah, I hear you. But, another good option would be actually is for him to go to Miami and be that. I would love him in Miami. Get that Heat team. Although Heat's not like Miami's had a great success with keeping guys on the floor either lately. So maybe you need to keep in mind on that. Finally, Scottie Barnes got the bag. Scottie Barnes secured a max extension with the Toronto Raptors on Monday. Look, I'm not surprised on this, where there was a couple of moments last season where it was getting kind of dicey, and Masai Ujiri reportedly had like a one-on-one meeting with him to kind of get his head straight. But since that time, like he was absolutely and he was phenomenal. Like Barnes really is incredible. Adrian Wojnarowski, by the way, first to report that, unsurprisingly. So max extension without an All-NBA nod, Barnes would be on track to earn $38.775 million, followed by 41.8 in 27, and then 45 million in 28 and 48 million in 29, $51 million in 2030. This makes a lot of sense. Look, Ujiri and the Raptors front office identified Barnes from the combine interview with him that like he was like the guy, and they traded OG and they traded Pascal, and they are building around Scotty Barnes. And even though I think they waited too long on those type of things, and I look at their roster and I'm like, what are you doing with Kelly Olynyk and Jakob Poeltl? Like what is the point here? Building around Scotty Barnes, I think, is a really good idea. He does have all NBA potential. Like he is that good of a player, but people are asking, like, this is the conversation today, is like, is Scotty Barnes really worth this kind of max? Is he that level of guy? Especially when we're starting to see some pushback from a lot of teams on the max extensions. Like we're starting to see teams be like Pascal Siakam starting to be like, well, no, maybe not the full max, like trying to pull back on some of that. Are you surprised that the Raptors went all in on Scotty Barnes?
Not at all. I mean, when you find a young foundational player, you do everything you can to build him. And that's just a smart way of operating, especially in today's NBA. Like we're dealing every summer, the NBA trade deadline, like the transactions are just what captivate so many fans. But you know what? If you can erase that and just forget about it, just found our future, and we want to do it to make sure that he understands how valued he is to us and how important he is to our future in terms of rebuilding the roster around him. You do it 100%. It's just money, it's not your money, and he's certainly fine collecting that check. And so I'm not sure that he's earned it up to that point, whatever that might mean, but I think it's very likely that he'll provide the kind of value that you'd be seeking for that sort of max contract, because he is so young, because he is so talented, and because he's shown so much throughout his brief career. But I think he's got a really bright future. I think it's a smart move, and it makes a lot of sense.
When you're listening to this on the podcast form, the NBA draft is tomorrow. So we're going to talk about what is this draft? It's very confusing all the way down. And why all of a sudden is Zachary Risachet the consensus number 1 pick? We'll talk about that and more up next on Locked On NBA. Back here on Locked On NBA, thanks for joining us and making us part of your day. If you got a second, if you're watching this on youtube.com/LockedOnNBA, give us a like and a subscribe. If you are listeners on a podcast, give us a 5-star review if you're listening on Apple. And if not, go to youtube.com/LockedOnNBA and hit the like and subscribe button.
Do all three.
It's the best way to support the show. We really appreciate it. So let's talk about this draft, David. Okay. Over the weekend, Zachary Risachet has now kind of coalesced into the consensus number 1. All of the major mock drafts that dropped on Monday all have Zachary Risachet number 1. And I think in this draft, there's no one you can tell me that you can list that I would be like, oh yeah, like that's crazy. Nobody. Like maybe Nikola Topic, maybe that one I'd be like, I don't know about that one. Don't know about the guard coming off of ACL surgery that can't shoot. But he's still probably going to go top 10. Trades are extremely possible. What I think is interesting here, as kind of a subtext, is it's not a secret that the Atlanta Hawks are known to be one of those teams with a lot of cooks in the kitchen. They've had ownership be very active and involved in various personnel decisions at times, at key moments, and then maybe not as involved. My understanding is that the front office, led by Landry Fields, does in fact want to draft Zachary Risachet if they keep the pick. They're open to trading it, but that would be the pick. That Quinn Snyder and the coaching staff leans towards Donovan Clingan. But there is a sense from the front office, we're not going to take Klingon number 1. We're instead going to we can move down and maybe get Klingon. But trades are hard to pull off, especially for a number 1 pick. Like, I think the ideal for them is, and I'll say this, again, based off of the people I've talked to, and this stuff is all very nebulous, and I'm not like, this is like super hard intel, and I know this. I'm just saying this is the impression I've been given, is that the San Antonio Spurs would very much like an opportunity to draft Zachary Redick. And so if you're trying to get the Spurs to trade up from number 4 so you can take Klingon, the best way for you to be, even if you like Klingon better, your best opportunity here is to project we're taking Redick because it puts the highest value on it. Nobody's going to believe it if you're like, we're taking Sar. Everybody's going to be like, really? He hasn't worked out for you, and you don't seem too upset about that. But Redick, on the other hand, does continuously seem like it's going to be up there. So I'll just tell you, I wouldn't be surprised if it was Redick. I wouldn't be surprised if they traded it and it was Sar. I wouldn't be surprised if it was Klingon. I wouldn't be surprised if it was Reed Shepherd, because I continue to kind of look at this whole board and be like, why not just draft Reed Shepherd? You're going to trade one of the guards anyway. Just take Reed Shepherd, who's I think might be better than these bigs anyway. It's crazy. The picks I've heard that are in play to be traded: 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 10. No, 9 and 10. No, not 7. 8, 9, and 10. Not 7. Blazers, I think, are going to keep their pick. It's crazy. There is no, and it's hard to make those deals. And we always hear a lot of smoke this time of year.
Yeah.
But I don't remember any time when I've legitimately been like, yeah, no, I think if you really wanted to, depending on how much you wanted to, 8 of the top 10 picks, I think you could probably put together a serious offer for and get deep into conversations for. It's wild.
Before I get to the Hawks decision process here, like, I'm surprised to hear you say that, because it's not that the intel is off, obviously, but I just, given the fact that there's so much, everybody's so muddled in this draft, like that there isn't that kind of significant drop off from pick 3 to pick 23. Everybody's kind of in this middle ground here. Like, what's the point of engaging in this kind of talk of, we really want to trade up and get that pick, when, like, if you don't get that player at number 8, you're probably going to get just as good a player at number 10 or 11, right? Like, there's not any one player that kind of stands out. So why would you be basically rearranging deck chairs just to get a higher pick when it doesn't really matter, considering the lack of high-end talent available at the draft?
So the idea here in particular for me is, I've heard pretty continuously since early on in the draft process that the Spurs are high on Redick. Now, I want to be very clear on this. I'm not on the phone with R.C. Buford and Greg Popovich, right? They are locked down. It's why I'm always very nervous whenever there's a consensus around a Spurs pick, because I'm like, that's not coming from them. But, like, people around the league believe at least that they're very high on Redick, okay? They're also supposed to be very high on Stephon Castle, who they can get with that 4th pick. If they trade the 8th pick, which they also own, and they move up, they can get Redick and Castle to go next to Victor Wembanyama. And now all of a sudden it's like, hey, okay, you've got the number 1 pick and 2 top 10 picks. And yes, it's a weaker draft, but if you're San Antonio, this also makes a lot of sense, where you have a lot of swings at the bat because of how many picks they have. And they're still probably going to pursue other trades and free agency stuff. That to me does make a little bit of sense if they wanted to move up. What doesn't make sense is something like Detroit wanting to move up. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me, right? Like, Detroit moving back makes sense to me, because I think there's a drop off after the top 4. I think that once you're into 5, and they're supposed to take Modest Bazelis, but I think that Detroit, the teams looking to move back make a lot of sense to me. The teams looking to move up, I agree with you. It does seem a little bit confusing outside of the Spurs.
Yeah, I mean, as far as Atlanta though, what want as far as what San Antonio potentially offer if they wind up trading to the number 1 pick, or if they trade up to the number 1 pick, what could Atlanta expect in a potential trade if they wind up getting that number 4 pick and looking to get Klingon in that pick?
I don't know. I'm gonna be honest, I don't know. And so I think it's,
can they expound it to include either DeJounte Murray, et cetera, or Trae Young, as we talked about?
That's one of the things that I think is really interesting here, right? So, like, there's been a kind of a consensus that San Antonio was not super high on the idea of trading for Trae Young. That was mostly coming from Trae Young's camp, which was mostly Clutch Sports, who no longer represents him, by the way. And that the Spurs are more interested in trading back for DeJounte Murray, which would be really funny. They could get some of their own picks back in that kind of a trade, which would be, again, really funny, kind of a just undo button click on for the Hawks to a certain degree. But that is, like, to me is kind of interesting, where it's okay if the Spurs are looking to add a point guard, and the Hawks have DeJounte Murray and Trae Young, even with Stephon Castle as a likely backcourt partner at number 4. What does that kind of look like, right? Or if they trade up, what does that look like? So I think there's a number of kind of options here, but it is just really interesting. Now, look, again, consensus across the board is that Zachary Redick is going number 1. Is that they're just going to take him, and that's entirely possible. I'm not going to sit here and be like, no, it's not happening, it's all smokescreen. No, it's entirely possible, because I don't think that any of these guys you can really be like, yeah, no, it's worth dealing with all this headache and hassle. Let's just take the best guy that we think, and front office thinks it's Redick. Let's just go ahead and go. Like, if the ownership group is just like, whatever the front office believes, we're going to back, it's probably Zachary Redick. And so that, to me, is really interesting. It does seem very much like Alex Sarr that was going to wind up a Washington Wizard. That, to me, seems very likely. And then it becomes a question of, does Houston trade? Because they've also had conversations about number 3. I heard they had actually turned down a lot of talks, but they have re-engaged for the 3. But it still seems very likely that Reed Shepherd's going to be there, which, by the way, hey, Reed Shepherd, it's a guard. Time to have more conversations about Jalen Green. You excited for that? You excited for more Jalen Green talk, David Ramil?
Absolutely. I love it. One of the brightest young players in the league.
All right. We'll see what happens with the draft. We'll have you covered here on Locked On NBA. Tomorrow, you got John Corrales, fresh off his championship book, by the way, Buzz, along with Jake Madison. You can catch Pat the Designer and Nick Angstadt later in the week, as Nick continues being a very sad panda. And on Friday, you got Wes Goldberg and Adam Mares on Friday's show. They'll talk about the aftermath and get you set for free agency, which starts over the weekend. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate you guys being with us. We'll see you guys again next time on Locked On NBA.